Welcome to the Farming Your Career podcast with host Dr. Aaron L. Albert, where we explore a variety of healthcare and pharmacy-related topics, including career development, healthcare IT, informatics, innovation, entrepreneurship, STEM, women's issues, and more. Farming Your Career podcast is part of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, and Aaron has had the #1 most downloaded episodes of 2016 and 2017 of the entire Pharmacy Podcast Network. Now, here's your host, Dr. Aaron L. Albert.
Welcome to Farming Your Career. I'm Aaron Albert. Today, the tables are turned and I become the guest on my own show with former APPE student on rotation with me, Kristen O'Donovan, who's currently a P4, on rotation, talking to me about my brand new book, Single Women Entrepreneurs, 5 Years Later. In fact, this episode is brought to you by the same. You can head on over to Amazon.com, just type in Single Women Entrepreneurs and purchase a Kindle version of this brand new book. Or you can exclusively head over to my website, dear listeners, go to aaronalbert.com, click on store. You'll find the book right there, and if you click the drop-down menu after clicking on the book, you can receive a very special offer just for our listeners where you can purchase this brand new book in physical form for just 1 penny. So give a listen to the episode, and hopefully I'll see you over at the website. And most of all, I hope you find this helpful for your own career. Okay, Pharmacy Podcast listeners, we're here today and the tables are being turned on the co-host, or the host in this case. And so I wanted to talk about my brand new book, Single Women Entrepreneurs, 5 Years Later. And Todd Urey, our fabulous founder of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, challenged me to find a student to do the interviewing of me rather than just me talking. So I had to go back to my Rolodex, and most recently I had Kristen O'Donovan with me on rotation at Myers and Stauffer, and I wanted to welcome her to the podcast to kind of do my job, and I'll be the interviewee today. So Kristen, welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's really exciting to sort of flip the script on you and put you in the hot seat this time.
Yeah, I'm feeling the pressure. I'm feeling the pressure. So, Kristen, let's talk a little bit about you, where you are in your rotations, and maybe what you want to do after pharmacy school.
Sure. So I actually started my rotations this January. You were my first rotation, so kicked it off with a great start, and I'm set to graduate this coming December of 2018. I, in addition to pharmacy, studied business in school. I got a minor in business, and those were some of my favorite classes I took every semester. So for a while, I've thought about, finding a career when I graduate that sits at the intersection of pharmacy and business. I may not know specifically what that looks like yet, but I would love to have a career that I can, keep up with both of those passions of mine. In addition to writing, I love writing. I have experience both as a writer and an editor. So whatever I do, I am sure that I will find a way to continue writing no matter what.
And that's why I thought of you, Kristen, because of our work together on BU Well, the open access healthcare journal, back in the day when I was in academia. And I loved your kind of business mindset as well as writing and editorial mindset too. So I thought you'd be a great student to kind of turn the tables and interview me on this new book, which is not exactly completely pharmacy or healthcare related, but still has a cast of healthcare and wellness professionals within it. So the book is called Single Women Entrepreneurs, 5 Years Later. And so Kristen, have at it. You get to question me now.
All right. So this book is the second in a series. It's a follow-up to a previous book you wrote called Single Women Entrepreneurs. Why did you originally write that first book in the series?
Yeah, so way back once upon a time, I was reading a study by the Kauffman Foundation. And for those who may not know, Kauffman does a lot of research in entrepreneurship and how it relates to economic development and communities. And so long ago, there was a report on gender, marital status, and entrepreneurship. And in this report, there was this little teeny tiny table that had gender, marital status, and entrepreneurship among the genders. And the one place where women outnumbered men in starting businesses was single women. And so I was starting to rifle through the report to read more about the data behind this table, and it really never went into any kind of great detail. And being a single woman entrepreneur myself, I started thinking, well, there have to be other women out there who have businesses, and why did they start them, and what's motivating them, and what extra special challenges do they have that maybe their male counterparts don't? And so that was where the first book was really born. And, that was more than 5 years ago now. And I wanted to follow up with these ladies and find out, do they still have businesses? Did they grow? Did they shrink? What happened? What radical or not radical changes happened in their lives? But I also have to give shout outs to a lot of people who not only returned to be interviewed, but maybe didn't have amazingly happy endings. And I think it's really brave, particularly those women who are willing to share their stories. And last but not least, I have to give a shout out to Dory Clark, who is one of my mentors and also was kind enough to write the foreword for this new book. And she, of course, has written Entrepreneurial You. She's been on the podcast as well. You can go back and listen to her episode. But all in all, this project was a lot of fun, and that's how the original book started.
Cool. Yeah. So I love that you went back and followed up, because I can't tell you how many times I've read something that's struck a nerve with me and then wondered later, I wonder what happened. So I love that you followed up. When you did that follow up, what surprised you about those original women 5 years later?
Yeah. So lots of really interesting stories. I guess I was most shocked by the variety in what happened to these women in just 5 short years. And to kind of give people a framework, the business variety that was in the original book and now in this follow-up book, it was everything from product-based businesses that had, like, for example, chocolate, coffee, and cupcakes. That's like my C trifecta right there, all the way through to services, everything from like lawyers, tax assessment, financial services, mortgages, marketing and branding. So we didn't just have, one business type. We had many business types. And so what I wanted to know was, with the wide kind of variety of things happening in the world, what happened to their businesses? And we had several cases where women were returning to provide their follow-up, but they had radically different businesses. Or they had moved different geographies and they had completely different lives. I mean, one of the perfect examples in the book, I think, was Nicole Allen Winfrey. And she owns a really cool company called Butterfly Consignment. But during the 5 years, she not only moved back home to Gary, Indiana, because Karen Freeman Wilson, who was the first African-American woman mayor in Indiana, asked her to come back to her hometown and serve the city, which she bravely did. But she also managed her business from over 3 hours away. But not only that, she got married and she started a family. So she had all this kind of radical change going on. Even though her business was very similar over those 5 years, she personally had very big differences in her lives. And then we did bring in one new gal to the fold who had not been in the original book. Her name is Mona Das. And what I loved about Mona was she is actually running for political office. And that was one of the other themes that I found throughout this study of the 5 years later, was there were several women that were very passionate about public service and running for office. So I loved that aspect as well. I think it's exciting that, in this era of Me Too, that women are saying enough and they're actually doing something about our political system. So I was excited to see that in follow-up as well.
I have to agree. I think I thought that was really exciting too, seeing women be able to pursue such a variety, be successful with changes, and to kind of run for office, things like that. But on the flip side of that, was there anything that you found disturbing when you went back and interviewed these women? And if so, what did you find disturbing?
Yes, in dark, there's always light, right? And vice versa with the Force. So some of the things that, I think have baffled the entrepreneurial community overall that continue here is the continued underfunding of women. And I think of a specific story in the book where a gal who had an award-winning business in Austin, Texas, her name is Patty Justice, and she had a pregnancy spa for pregnant mothers, and she's a massage therapist herself. And her company, in the 5 years that it was established, won award after award in the city. Everybody loved it. However, she just had to close her business because she was underfunded and she never drew a salary for herself. So even in the case of a successful business, and I use, kind of air quotes around successful, sometimes the women are just not getting funding to the level that they need to sustain their really successful businesses over time. So I thought that was a trend, and it's not inconsistent with what I've seen outside of the book, but it just kind of confirmed that. The other trend that I saw was in the original book, there were a lot of women who kind of had their entrepreneurial endeavor on the side as a side hustle. And we've talked about that here on the podcast as well. And, one of the issues or challenges with that was that if women lost their day jobs, that kind of also threw their entrepreneurial endeavors in doubt at some points. There was a gal in the book who had made many day job switches over the past 5 years. And she just got to the point where she was burned out on her business and is now selling or in the process of selling her business. So I still argue that cities, states, communities are not doing enough to support the women who are brave enough to even start entrepreneurial endeavors on the side. And burnout is a real issue among entrepreneurs. And you and I both know this from a healthcare perspective, Kristen, in that, healthcare professionals really get burned out too, but so do entrepreneurs. And then I guess it's not really disturbing, but I found some kind of interesting comments throughout the book when I was doing the interviews. I was struck by the rapid amount of change in just 5 short years by most of the women. One of the women, Andrea Bloom, who runs a consulting company around wellness and building wellness programs for large corporations, said a couple of really interesting comments, one of which was her population or her demographic in the 50-plus age group is starting to face a lot of age discrimination when it comes to jobs and career development. And I thought that was really interesting, and that she said or argued that having her own business insulated her from that, whereas her peers who had quote-unquote, normal day jobs were starting to run into the brick wall of age discrimination or being overqualified for jobs. And I'm wondering, if entrepreneurship is a solution to that. She argues it is because, again, she's insulated from it. So overall, I wouldn't say all of those are disturbing. I would just say that some of them are very interesting and kind of thought-provoking.
So you mentioned about different avenues, I guess, that some of these women pursued entrepreneurship, whether that was full-time or having, like you mentioned, a side hustle. How did women go about this in the first book, and did that change for them in the second book?
Yeah, so some of the women, as I mentioned before, completely changed their businesses, or they would add on a business. Denise Prawl is the perfect example of that. She is a tax assessor, so when your property tax slips come in and they're ridiculously high, she will go to battle for you, basically. But beyond that accurate tax management business in the subsequent 5 years, she also created a company called Whiteboard Learning. And that had really shifted her passion from, tax abatement to trying to have students in an adult learning environment where she was becoming more of a teacher and a scholar. And she really moved her passion over, if you will. There were, like I mentioned before, one gal is selling her business. She's, again, burned out. And I think when you have a day job and that one may change, or you may change cities or geographies, there's a lot of stress associated with that. And that stress trickles down to your business, even if it's a side hustle. So I think that's kind of unfortunate. Although I do believe businesses and entrepreneurship is like everything else. There's a season for it, perhaps. It would be just lovely to see more women who are supported around their business ideas and then can sustain them over the long period. Some businesses actually grew, so we had lots of happy endings as well in terms of business and growth. Noise 13 Design is a company out in the San Francisco Bay Area by David Guthmiller, and her story is phenomenal in the book. She's had tremendous success while she's been out there. A couple of the companies that she services through her business are companies like Tile and Uber, and she took those businesses on when they were the first ones in the marketplace with their products and services. So imagine a design firm and a branding firm that is designing or branding a product like Tile that's never even been in a retail store. So you have to think about things like, where would that product even go inside a retail store, like a Walmart or a Target? All the way through to Uber. You know, what is Uber? How do you use it? And doing the education around the use of it. We kind of take that all for granted now. But back in the day, she was the first branding firm to work with Uber. So I think there's some really exciting work that some of these SWEs are doing. And, you know, my local favorite example is the Best Chocolate in Town. They're down on Mass Avenue. And their brick and mortar has doubled. So Elizabeth Garber is the owner down there. And in the past, you could just walk in and order and pick up your chocolates and leave. But now she's got this cool third space on a really cool kind of refurbished area of Indianapolis on Massachusetts Avenue. And even walking in there, you just want to stay forever because it smells wonderful. So there are happy endings in this book, and I've loved learning about all of them.
Yeah, I think everyone loves a good happy ending, a good success story. So kind of going off of that success idea, when you interviewed these women, overall, were most of them meeting their own terms of success?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and that's one I asked in the original book, and then I wanted to follow up and ask it again, just to see if their own personal definitions had changed over time. And, you know, one of the interesting changes that happened with some of the gals were in that 5-year period that some of them had gotten married and or had children, and their priorities had shifted. Not to say that it's a bad thing, but having a family and how the business fits in versus the family priorities. So with some of those gals, I asked them, you know, probably an inappropriate question, but I asked them, you know, do you see yourself as a mom who has a business? And does the being a mom come first, or does the business come first? One gal said, far and away, my child is first and foremost in my life. I would drop everything for my child. But one of the other gals had said something really interesting about, I think I'm a better mom because I prioritize my business equally with my child, but they're very different things. So she wasn't saying that, you know, she was first and foremost a mom. She was kind of both. She was an entrepreneur and she had a child. I thought that was really interesting that these women, particularly that are having, you know, families, view entrepreneurship a little bit differently from one another. So I don't know if men have to worry about that as much, since the caregiving at home and the rearing of children is predominantly a woman's focus within the marriage. Not always, and of course there's different situations there. But I just thought that was a really interesting data point that was different among some of the women.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. So kind of going off of that, those two examples you gave, the two moms that sort of had a different spin on how that defined their success, were there any overlaps that you found to be common among the women in their definitions of success, or were they all more individualized?
I think there were parallels in terms of common themes. So, personal satisfaction and making the world a better place and serving the customer were kind of commonalities among most of the women. But there were subtle differences, and a lot of them even took subtle tweaks on their own definition of success over the past 5 years, based upon their own individual situations and what happened to them over the course of time. So, similarities and differences, and I know that's a terrible answer, but there were common themes. And I think, one of them is, I don't think all these women were starting businesses, to go back to the original book, to build empires. Like, they didn't want to go out and, be the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next Elon Musk or Peter Thiel. They're doing and starting their businesses because something's not working with the traditional 9-to-5 paradigm for them. Either they have kids at home, or they're taking care of parents, or they're sandwich generation and they're taking care of both. And they just couldn't make that quote unquote traditional 9-to-5 work life balance for them. So they had to kind of create or reinvent their entire life, of which that included starting a business.
So you're a single woman entrepreneur, and now you've followed this cohort of women for years. So taking all of that information that's maybe intrinsic or that you've gathered from these women, what advice do you have for women who are starting to think about a business of their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the changes that kind of happened in the big publishing literature too over that course of 5 years and between studying this cohort was that a lot of the gurus, the academicians, were finally saying, hey, starting a part-time business is okay to do. Because when I wrote and published this first iteration of this book, it seemed like the common literature was all about you either need to pick one or the other. You cannot do both. You can't be a part-time entrepreneur. There is no part-time. You're either all one or all the other. And in 2016, Adam Grant published a book called Originals. And in that book, he studied and talked about the Warby Parker guys, of which were his students while he was teaching. And they were accounting majors. So they had, consulting day jobs, 9-to-5. And what I loved about that book was he was talking about how they started Warby Parker on the side. And now it's a full-time venture for them. I think they just got another $250 million in funding. It's super successful. It's kind of changed the paradigm of how we buy glasses in this country, which I think is really cool. But I love the bottom line in that people could be part-time entrepreneurs and full-time employees. And in fact, I wrote a book about that too. But I think the bottom line is there that women can start small and think big. So you start that business on the side. And many of the women in this book still have side hustles that, their entrepreneurial endeavors are in addition to their day jobs. The other really important point, I think, is get a mentor, get several mentors. And I've talked about that throughout several books that I've written. I think it's super important to have a variety of mentors in your life that have been there, done that can kind of guide you through the next levels of challenges. Because as an entrepreneur, you feel very kind of isolated at points in time. It's not like you're you have a full office that you go to every day with, 50 people just like you, unless you have the luck of working in a co-working space with other entrepreneurs or something like that. It can be very isolating. So you kind of have to force yourself to find some people of like-mindedness who can help you along the way, that are 1 or 2 or even 10 steps ahead of you. And then last but not least, get around people like you. I think, again, Mona Das in the book said, women entrepreneurs are kind of their own little group and they think very differently. And I agree with that. So try to find people like you that you can hang out with because, that old adage, birds of a feather flock together. You are like the 5 people you hang out with the most. I think is really important, especially as an entrepreneur. So find other people of like mind.
I'm going to circle back to something you mentioned in an earlier question. You talked about how you think communities can be doing more. Mm-hmm. So what advice do you have for communities to support women who are starting their own businesses?
Yeah, I've been ranting about this one a lot lately on social media, so I'm going to try not to get too high on my soapbox here. But I think the first thing communities need to do is really untangle and find affordable living options for people who want to be creative and entrepreneurial. And so what I mean by that is that we need to find housing, commercial space that entrepreneurs who are daring to start up businesses can afford without going bankrupt. And again, I'd hate to go back to it, but again, Patty Justice's story in this book about Austin, Texas, and her business is the perfect example of this. That even though she felt like she was doing everything right with her business, it still in some ways failed. Now, she has a great happy ending, and actually she got a great day job out of her experience in running her own business. But where was Austin, Texas in supporting her beyond, giving her an award every year? And what drives me nuts about a lot of communities these days is that they will give all these huge incentives for large companies to come in that are going to, quote unquote, hire a bunch of employees. But they don't do anything to support the people that are already living in the community who are daring to start businesses. So whether that's tiny houses and affordable living in that respect, not having a mortgage. I mean, think about not having any debt and how much freedom that allows the innovative individual to kind of create. To spaces where they can safely create and have storefronts and pop-up shops. To, even mid-career and end-career fellowships in entrepreneurship and innovation. I think a lot of cities and states have done a great job in plugging brain drain and getting, college kids out right after school into a fellowship in entrepreneurship or innovation. What's missing in the marketplace right now are mid to end career, in terms of their first career anyway, fellowships for people who have entrepreneurial ideas, but they may still have a lot of debt associated with their mortgage or paying for their kids' college or just life getting in the way. So those are all kind of opportunities that I think cities and states need to pay attention to, because if they truly want to foster the creative class, they have to make living affordable.
Yeah, I agree. I think the especially the mid-career fellowship idea is interesting, especially because so many people don't just have the same career from the time they start working till they retire. A lot of people kind of change what they're doing. So not everyone listening to the podcast is going to be a single women entrepreneur.
Right.
But I think a lot of people could benefit from reading this book. So who do you think should read this book?
Yeah, and that's one thing I learned from self-publishing school that I just started in January is you can't be everything to everyone, right? So you have to clearly articulate who your audience is for your book. So I think everyone that reads this book should either come from women, the camps, who are either thinking about starting a business, or maybe they're getting ready to retire and they'd love to do some consulting, or people in general who support women entrepreneurs. So a great common theme in this new book was the men, actually, who were supporting or coupled up with the women over the past 5 years. And many of them were entrepreneurs themselves. So like attracts like, I guess. That shouldn't be a surprise. But I think men who honestly want to support their significant others who dare to start businesses should benefit from reading this book. And then last but not least, again, every mayor, governor, elected official should be reading this book as well, because frankly, the future is freelance and female. We now know that by 2020, 40% of the workforce is going to be freelance in this freelance gig economy, yet schools are not training and preparing students for that. And as well, I think it was just last year or the year before was the first time ever that more women were going to graduate school, PhD programs, than men. And that sea change points to the fact that more women are going to start businesses. More women are going to be at the helms of organizations in the future. So anybody who cares about that should be reading this book.
It's really clear talking to you that you're very passionate about this topic and about entrepreneurship. And I love that passion comes through when we talk. So, because this is such a passion of yours, what other books have you written about this topic?
Yeah, thanks. And, that's another soapbox that I love getting on. And I don't think pharmacy schools are doing enough to prepare students for entrepreneurship as an option. Standard 4 of ACPE. I sound like a broken record because I feel like I say that every podcast, but it's really true. In that I think pharmacy used to be super entrepreneurial and we've kind of gotten away from that. So I want to bring that back. And that's where my passion stems from. So parts of other books that I've written have focused either solely on entrepreneurship or on the part-time entrepreneur. Everything from the mentoring aspect. In 2017, I wrote with one of my mentors, The She, He Says Guide to Mentoring, with David Borse. That was a great book if you're looking for mentors, kind of how to go about that as a woman. In 2015, I wrote a book called Multi-Patientals, The Changing World of Work, and How to Create Your Best Career Portfolio. And that one really focused on the idea of having not one, but many careers going on simultaneously, which seems to be a trend that I'm still seeing in the marketplace. Everybody asks me, well, how do you get to do all these different things? Well, I don't think it's just doing one thing anymore. I don't think that's safe in terms of your own career development. So I wrote that book to focus on how the rock stars in my life are doing that. The New Pharmacist, 46 Doses of Advice. When I was back in academia, inevitably students about 2 to 3 years post-graduation would send me the random email, Dr. Albert, oh my God, I'm at, whatever retail outlet. Is this all there is? And so I wrote a book to talk about all the options post-fellowship or residency that are available for pharmacy students, of which entrepreneurship is part of that. The part-time entrepreneurial endeavor was in a book called Plan C, The Full-Time Employee and Part-Time Entrepreneur. That was quite a while ago, back in 2011. But I really wanted to look at people who either wanted to do a side hustle all the way through to I'm leaving my traditional 9 to 5 and I'm going to go be a full-time entrepreneur. So I looked at that spectrum in that. And then, of course, the first book, Single Women Entrepreneurs. And then last but not least, I was super interested in plugging brain drain here in central Indiana. So I wrote a couple of books called Indianapolis Young Professionals Guide. And in that book was a list of resources for fellowships, entrepreneurial endeavors, etc. So even though those books seem radically different, they all kind of have that common thread of entrepreneurship at some degree or level.
Right. I have to say, The New Pharmacist, The New Pharmacist, 46 Doses of Advice, was really influential for me during pharmacy school. I actually keep that one in my nightstand, but kind of like you mentioned with that, it really opened my eyes to all of the options that are available to a PharmD graduate beyond what we're normally taught about. So I definitely picked up on the theme of entrepreneurship in that book as well.
Good. It's good to know the circle is complete on that one.
Yep, definitely. So going back to this book, are there any, maybe one story that really stood out to you, one story of one entrepreneur that really stands out in your mind?
Yeah, there's a lot. I really appreciated that, I guess, every woman in the book had the brave kind of audacity to share the changes that happened with them over the 5 years. I mean, I already mentioned Dava Guthmiller. I love her story. The Bay Area and San Francisco gets criticized for being very tech heavy and very male heavy. And her firm, when I talked to her, was all female, which really was kind of almost like a unicorn in the Bay Area. So I love that, and then coupled with her customers being innovators, true innovators in a category, building the category. So not only are you marketing the product like Tile or Uber, but you're also educating the consumer on what those even are and how they can be used and then placing them in a store. So I love that story. I also love that she talked about her significant other and helping him start his business. as well. So I thought that was great. There were some other women that were Larvetta Lofton out of Chicago. I loved her story. She actually had quite a bit of personal changes over the 5 years. She was married and divorced subsequently within the 5 years. And how she approached that major, major life change and how she managed it with her clients and customers is another phenomenal story that I think a lot of readers would benefit in reading about. And, again, the bravery of all these women that are running for office. I think there were 2 or 3 women in the book that were running for some type of local, if not larger, political office when I interviewed them. I think that's something that, I personally would aspire to down the road. It's definitely not today or tomorrow. But I love that, these women were channeling the rage, so to speak. And I mean that in a kind way, I guess. In a positive way, right? Like, so if you get mad, just don't sit there and complain about it. Do something. And that's what I really, really loved about the women who were kind enough to share their triumphs and, tribulations, as well as their bravery in stepping up and trying to say yes to something as big as political office. So let me ask you a question, Kristen.
All right. Okay.
I know you've previewed the book. So who resonated with you? And you're at a point in your career where you're getting ready to launch it pretty much full time, in T-minus how many months? 6 months ish.
Mm-hmm. But who's counting?
Right. So, and I know, you're not necessarily going to be an entrepreneur right out of school yourself necessarily. So who in the book resonated with you?
So a lot of the stories in the book resonated with me because I think a lot of them offered sort of different pearls of advice that I really took to heart. 2 that really stood out, which is funny because both of them you've already mentioned, but Patty Justice really stood out to me as an example of failure, but failure that had success on the other side of it. So her business closed despite being award-winning every year, which again kind of goes back to that community support issue. But despite that, not long after, she got a great full-time job offer as a result of her work with her business. So even though that business closed, it landed her a great opportunity at the end of it. And she's, still successful even after a failure. I think that's great for me in my stage of life to keep in mind because I'm sure I will have failures as I go. I really don't know many people that don't have things not go their way at least once throughout their career. So that's a great sort of story to keep in mind that things do happen, but that there's still opportunities for success on the other side.
Yeah.
Another one that really stood out to me was Elizabeth Garber. First, because it was in Indianapolis, and I've never been there, and now it's on my list of places to go, the best chocolate in town, because I, too, love chocolate.
Yes.
But she gave some really great pearls of advice. I think as a woman in general, she talked about, that women have a lot of choices now that maybe a few generations ago weren't so. So that kind of reminds me of how fortunate I am to be starting a career in this day and age where women do have so many choices and where I really can keep an open mind and think outside of the box in terms of what I want to do with this next phase of my life moving forward. So I really liked that point. And then she also had another piece of advice that really resonated with me, which was don't force things. I think that a lot of people, especially maybe pharmacy majors who are type A and have a certain plan, will maybe try to force things. And she really gave this pearl that I loved that was don't force things. If they're not meant to be, things will kind of fall into place the way that they're meant to. And sometimes you need to sit back and let things happen organically. So I thought that was great advice. And then multiple women said this. She's one of them, but I know other women did too. I think Patty and Elizabeth both made comments about sort of listening to your gut, having faith in yourself and giving yourself enough credit that your intuitions, your instincts are probably right. So don't discredit those instincts. Listen to them.
Yeah, that's something I'm always working on too. I agree with you.
So where can people because this book is fantastic. It's got great advice, like I talked about. So where can people find this book? And then where can people find these women, this cohort of women that you interviewed?
Yeah, so the book is already available on Amazon.com. So you can just go over there and type in Single Women Entrepreneurs, and that should pop up, as well as the first edition of the book. But in terms of the hard copy, it will only be available in a limited print run edition through my own website. So if you go over to erinalbert.com and click on the store, it'll be there. And then just for our fabulous listeners, I've got a special deal that I will only run for a limited time after this podcast posts, where you can get a hard copy of this book for 1 penny. So I will put in show notes how to do that. But basically, you go over to erinalbert.com, click on the store, click on the new book, and then you'll select the option of Pharmacy Podcast discount price, and you'll see the price move down to 1 cent. So again, I'm only doing a very limited print run because I love books. I don't know how you feel, Kristen, but I struggle to read books on Kindle. So I wanted to do a print run of these books, but I'm only going to do a couple hundred copies. And most of them are already reserved. You can buy it now, but I'm going to have this special deal going for Pharmacy Podcast listeners as a huge thanks to everyone who supported this book. As well, we have a Facebook group of about 3,000 people that are passionate about single women entrepreneurs. You can go over to Facebook, again, type in Single Women Entrepreneurs, and our tribe should pop up there. You can join it. And last but not least, I have to thank Todd Urey for being super supportive, allowing me the opportunity to share this kind of a little bit off the beaten path topic. It's not completely pharmacy focused, although we do have another pharmacist or two in the book. And healthcare in general and wellness. We have a couple of gals there that I hope to bring onto the show at a later date and share their experiences as well. But I'm super excited that Todd has been very accommodating in allowing us, you and me, Kristen, to chat about this book today. So, Kristen, thank you as well for taking your time out of your busy rotation schedule to interview former Professor Albert.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun. And thank you for taking the time to write both of these books. I know that it's a lot of work that you put in, a lot of hours, but these stories are great. I gain a ton of advice from my perspective that I carry with me. So thank you for having me, and thank you for taking the time to make all of this great information available and share these stories with us.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Farming Your Career. I'm Erin Albert. Special thanks to Kristen O'Donovan today, who turned the tables on me and did a phenomenal job in interviewing. As well, this episode was brought to you by the new book, Single Women Entrepreneurs 5 Years Later. You can purchase a Kindle version over at Amazon.com, or as I shared previously, you can exclusively go over to erinalbert.com, click on store, and get your physical copy of Single Women Entrepreneurs 5 Years Later for just 1 penny. Hope to see you over there. Until then, we always welcome your feedback. You can find me on Twitter at Erin L. Albert or at Farming Careers. And last but certainly not least, you can find us at Pharmacy Podcast. Make it a great day.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Farming Your Career podcast, part of the Pharmacy Podcast Network. If you have ideas or comments for Erin, be sure to contact her through Twitter. Follow her at Erin L. Albert. And remember to keep your career growing.